Visiting another country is an exciting and life-changing experience. I can remember the first time I travelled abroad in my early 20s to Japan. I had no idea what to expect. I didn't speak the language. I'd never even eaten sushi before, and I knew next to nothing about the culture. If only social media had been around back then, things would have been so much easier. The same goes for my experience coming to Vietnam. Back at the beginning of 2010, when I first came here to live, thinking back, I was just so poorly prepared. I thought because I'd travelled here for a couple of weeks 10 years before that it would set me up for living, working and travelling here. How wrong was I? And the mistakes I made. Well, I'm determined not to let the same thing happen to you if you're coming to Vietnam. So in this video, I've drawn on my years of experience living here to come up with a bunch of things I recommend you don't do so that you can transition into life here a bit more comfortably, whether you're traveling, working, or just visiting friends and family here. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll thank me for it. Righto, let's get into it. Now, you're a big chance to cop this straight out of the gate at the airport and for your entire stay. It still happens to me to this day, so don't be offended when it happens. It's common here for people to ask what your age is because your age has a bearing on your place in the pecking order of a community. Less so if you're foreign, you'll always be a noi nuk noi, a foreigner, but still, and your place in the pecking order manifests itself through the language. You see, everyone is assigned pronouns, and these pronouns constantly change depending on who you're talking to, which does happen in English, but to a lesser extent. Typically, we'll choose to call people by their names, whereas the Vietnamese have a preference for using pronouns. Now, I don't know how many different pronouns the Vietnamese language has, but it could be dozens. Thankfully, as foreigners though, we're not expected to know them all. But I'll give you a quick primer in any case. So anyone talking to me who's younger than me will call me An, and I'll call them M, and I'll refer to myself as An, and then they'll refer to themselves as M. But the tables are turned when I speak to someone older than me. I now become M, and they are An if they're a man, or G if they're a woman around the same age or maybe a little older. See, it's already becoming a little bit confusing, isn't it? Well, it's even more so once you get into all the pronouns for family members, along with those who are from inside and outside the family, like who we would call in-laws. But hey, you don't have to worry about that. So what's the upside to all this? Well, you don't have to remember anyone's name. Just ask them how old they are and call them An, M, or G accordingly. Seeing we're on the topic of language, let's knock this one off. No one likes to be told an abrupt no matter what the language, especially English speakers. But there's a good chance you'll hear it a lot when you're here in Vietnam. For instance, you might be looking for a bathroom, and when you ask if you can use the one in a cafe, you might get an abrupt no and interpret it as not for you to use, when in fact it may just be occupied or out of order. Or let's see, you might ask for a Coke with your lunch and get an abrupt no from the waiter. Then find out later they have Pepsi. In fact, it could be in any situation, and as English speakers, hearing an abrupt no can sound abrasive and impolite. Well, in Vietnamese, the use of com, the word for no, is highly prevalent, and given that the language is spoken with, how should I say, a high level of fervour, then it's quite common for Vietnamese speakers of English to replicate that tone when they speak English, so that no comes out sounding rather curt and unpleasant. Other things that might throw you off are yeah, which if used in English is impolite and comes across as though someone is fobbing you off or reluctantly doing something you've told them repeatedly to do. However, it's actually polite in Vietnamese. Young people will use it when they're responding positively to people who are older than them to show respect. Listen for it the next time you order something at a cafe or restaurant. And another one that tends to grate is you. People who have low proficiency in English will use this to catch your attention. They're not intentionally trying to be impolite. It's just that it's probably the only way they know to refer to you. Remember earlier I mentioned the pronouns used in Vietnamese? Well, probably in their mind they're going, is he younger than me or older than me? Hang on, is it a man or a woman? Surely he doesn't speak Vietnamese. Ah, what the hell? You! The sooner you realise you can't single-handedly change Vietnamese culture, especially as a foreigner, the better. And the sooner you stop railing against it or pushing back against it, digging your heels in, whatever you want to call it, the easier things will become in Vietnam. Your anxiety levels will come down, there'll be less conflict in your life, your patience will improve, and your tolerance for the way things are done here will move closer to the happier end of the spectrum. This doesn't mean you should just do away with whatever values you live by and turn a blind eye to serious concerns or push back against your own culture and upbringing. Rather, try to come up with ways that will help mitigate the negative emotions that build up when handling unexpected or unfamiliar situations that arise from time to time. This might mean you'll need to plan a little bit more in advance. For example, if you know that your driving license is coming up for renewal, a process which can take up to a couple of weeks, and multiple visits to multiple offices that handle licensing, which I now believe is being handled by the police stations, by the way. I need to check that before I renew mine soon. Or you may need to take some time to psych yourself up, as I do, whenever I need to visit the bank. Of course, sometimes you don't have the time to prep yourself for such visits, or you might be new here and simply just need to find out for yourself. But like I said, the sooner that you understand that this is just simply how it's done, then you'll find life becomes more chilled. Now, I understand this is a pretty simplistic way to look at life here because you'll no doubt come up against things that are far more serious than just going to the bank or getting your license renewed. Like, you may have strong feelings about the dog meat trade or domestic violence or human rights or your rights as a tenant. That's great, and they're all valid concerns, but perhaps seeking out community groups that deal with these issues and getting involved to help make change is a better strategy than just venting on social media. One thing's for sure, however, I've learned a lot about myself by living here in Vietnam. Things that I probably would never have learned had I stayed living in my comfort zone in Australia. I feel another video coming on. Okay, this is a pretty serious one in the context of where I live, and to me it's an obvious one, and that may be because I've been living here for a long time. And I've become attuned to the expectations placed on the community in regard to how to behave. But before I get into it, please be mindful of what you say in the comments on this one. I don't want this channel to become political and have unwanted attention drawn to it, if you know what I mean. Thanks in advance. So if you're not familiar with Vietnam's governance, then I suggest you do a little research online so that this point will resonate more with you. Now, for Westerners, e.g. Australians like me, this important point might not be so obvious because poking fun at our political leaders like our Prime Minister is basically a national pastime. It's part of our psyche. It injects a lot of humour into our day, and we also like to challenge our political leaders and their parties on their policies. And as for Australian history, well, it's constantly being debated over its veracity in terms of whether what we're told is actually true or not. And obviously that alone generates what you might call robust debates in both traditional and non-traditional media. And typically our national heroes are often sports people or entertainers anyway, so they're cannon fodder for ridicule. But this isn't the case in Vietnam. As you likely know, Vietnam has a vastly different history from Australia, for example, and was founded under entirely different circumstances. So even discussing the country's history and its founding fathers is done with great care and respect, and most definitely without any satire. So my advice is, when visiting cultural relics and museums in Vietnam, or when something challenges your idea of reality about Vietnam, try to respect the fact that this is how Vietnam wants its history and its story told, whether you agree with it or not, and refrain from doing anything that might be interpreted as disrespectful while you're here. It might be best to keep your criticisms to the weather or how slow the service is at your restaurant. I know that sounds a little patronising, but that's the way it is. While the average Vietnamese person these days is open to differences of opinion and different ways of thinking, Perhaps your discussions with the locals might be best centred around the history of beer or the history of banh mi, if you're into history. Or how about this? The positive outlook the Vietnamese have for the future. Okay, so we've got some of the more serious ones out of the way. Let's have a bit more fun with the rest, hey? I believe this one has its roots in Confucianism, which traditionally is patriarchal in nature and places great emphasis on the regulation of social behaviour through its patriarchy, leading to a social norm that discourages overt displays of affection, or what you and I might call PDA, public displays of affection, like kissing and hugging in public. Now, I read somewhere while researching this that strict traditional etiquette in cultures influenced by Confucianism requires distance to be maintained by males and females in public, so much so that they should not allow their hands to touch. Okay, that's pretty old school, but you can see how uncomfortable hugging or kissing someone in public might make them feel. I do actually have experience of this when one time I forgot this norm, or I guess I just felt as though my female Vietnamese friend was, for want of a better word, up for it. Meaning a hug in public when I was saying goodbye. Get your mind out of the gutter. And when I went to lean in, she pulled away suddenly, indicating that it made her uncomfortable. Funny when I look back on it, because it left two uncomfortable people standing out in public. Despite Vietnam urbanising rapidly over the past decade or so and being more exposed to individualistic Western ways of life, witnessing displays of affection like hugging and kissing is still rare, which tells me it's still not the done thing in 2025. And let's put aside the young ones for a moment. It's rare for me to see married Vietnamese couples hug or kiss each other in public. And I'm not just talking about making out passionately here. I'm talking about just saying goodbye at the airport terminal gates or when they're off to work or something like that, you know, like you would see in Western societies. In fact, the other day, even I had to do a double take when I saw a young couple innocently canoodling by the lake. And then I remember thinking, just get a room. But yeah, it can be confusing, not Confucian, confusing in that PDAs aren't a thing here. But then the culture can be quite sexualized in many ways, if you know what I mean. It's well known that holidaymakers sometimes wind up dead for doing stupid shit. And it seems it happens even more these days because of social media, with people chasing views on their content. I mean, what sort of shallow person would chase views for their videos? Anyhow, it happens, obviously. While this one is a universal warning and not necessarily unique to visiting Vietnam, I think it's still worth adding to this list. It's got to be noted that just travelling in Vietnam for starters is a pretty high-risk activity. I mean, you've seen or heard about the traffic chaos, and the attitude towards public safety is, well, let's just say you're on your own when it comes to public liability after you fall down a hole in the footpath. You really need to take responsibility for your own safety. So putting yourself at even greater risk by inserting yourself into dangerous situations like our man on the thumbnail for this video, I still can't work out if that's a real photo or not. Anyway, it just elevates the chances of something going wrong. And let's face it, while medical services are improving greatly in Vietnam, mostly in the major cities, there's a good chance that you'll need them in more remote areas, like out on the Ha Giang Loop up north while riding your motorbike illegally. Or in the mountains of the Central Highlands, or deep in the swamps of the Mekong Delta. And my friend, medical care and repatriation to a facility is both drawn out and expensive. Travel insurance companies love denying these kinds of claims. But doing stupid shit for the views is not just about risk to your personal safety and others. Doing it at cultural relics or in front of statues of national heroes, well, that's just in bad taste and downright disrespectful. Look, I've been guilty of doing stupid shit in the past. I was 25 once, you know. And I'm not trying to be, what do you call it, one of those male Karens, but try and ask yourself before doing something idiotic, would you do something stupid like this in your own country. Okay, our last one for this list needs a little explaining. You see, socializing is quite a different beast here in Vietnam, and for the sake of keeping things short and sweet, I'm just going to quickly touch on some of the etiquette around Nho culture, something that I've already mentioned quite a bit in previous videos, so go and have a look at those if you need a primer. But Nho culture centers around friends or work colleagues going out to a place like a pub in the evenings or at weekends for drinking and eating and bonding and letting their hair down a bit after a long week at work. So during these, okay, let's be honest here, piss-up sessions, there are a few things you need to keep in mind if you get invited along or if you invite them along. So first things first, don't expect people to arrive on time. Being late is a thing here. They'll turn up eventually. Next, don't necessarily think you've been invited along because you're cool and great to be around. Sometimes it might be the case that you're there just as the token foreigner, or in my case, the token white guy. Now, don't take this as an affront. Get over it and take it for what it is. But usually it's fair to say you've been invited along, well, because you're actually liked. Next, don't take a sip of your beer or whatever you're drinking without inviting the rest of the table. It's a really easy one to forget and won't get you banished from the table, but it's something you should get accustomed to. Sometimes when I'm drinking with my friends, I like to up the ante a bit and be the first one in quick succession to invite the table to drink, just to be a smartass. Another one is that eating and drinking go hand in hand here, literally. So don't be surprised if you're past something to try in someone's fingers. Yeah, I'll just leave you with that one. But also expect that your bowl or whatever you're eating from will be constantly added to as you slowly pick your way through whatever you're eating. You get force-fed all the time. And for the boys watching this, when it's time to go to the bathroom, try not to get stage fright when you notice that the person mopping the floor around you is a woman. Yeah, that's quite common. I mean, what would be the other option though? A man mopping around you as you pee? And then finally, at the end of the session, a couple of things are going to happen. One is that the bill has already been called for, even though you're just starting to settle in. And two, a squabble over who's going to pay will ensue, and with plenty of back and forth and so on. Now, let's say that you've organised the gathering and invited people along. Best practice when it comes to the bill is for you to be one step ahead somehow and sneakily pay for the bill before your guests find out, because it's good form as the host to pay for the invitees for coming along. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but I've been on the receiving end of this kind of hospitality in Vietnam more times than I can remember. So perhaps when you nick off to the bathroom, make a point of paying the bill on the way back before anyone notices and before things become uncomfortable over it. Righto, that's it for this one. I hope you've learned something and that it's helped prepare you a little bit for your experience in Vietnam. Now, I'm sure I've forgotten plenty of things, so please drop those in the comments and I'll get back to you pretty soon. I look forward to seeing them. They'll be interesting. Until next time, take care and stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.